They tortured the alien princess on the bridge until a human pulled a blaster on his own captain. The bridge of the human warship Resolute was not supposed to be a stage for cruelty, yet the moment the alien princess was dragged through its wide steel doors and chains, the atmosphere shifted from tense professionalism into something darker, something that made even the most hardened crewmen avert their eyes while pretending to keep busy at their stations. The hum of consoles and the distant thrum of the engines doing nothing to disguise the raw spectacle of humiliation at the center of their command. She was tall, despite the shackles biting into her wrists, her alien features luminous even under the harsh white lights above, her violet skin marred with bruises where guards had struck her, her eyes too large, too unearthly for comfort still, burning with a defiance that unsettled the men who held her. The captain, a man named Garin, who prided himself on order and discipline, stood rigid at the command chair, his jaw clenched, his voice as cold as the void outside as he ordered her. Thrown before him, the sound of metal striking metal as she fell to her knees echoing with a violence more brutal than the act itself. "You think we don't know what you've done," he said, his words measured, cruelly calm, as if every syllable were a knife meant to slice away at her dignity. "Sabotage, treachery, feeding intelligence to your kind." The alien princess raised her head, slow, deliberate, her lips trembling but refusing to form a plea, and in that silence the human who stood at his console, a junior pilot named Kale, felt the churn in his gut deepen, for he had watched her before this moment, not as an enemy or prisoner, but as someone who had once moved through the corridors of the ship with grace, a guest of war, an exchange meant to secure fragile peace before everything collapsed, and he could not reconcile the memory of that presence with the bound figure now on the floor. Around him, the crew avoided each other's gaze, eyes fixed on monitors that displayed meaningless readouts, none willing to speak, none willing to intervene, for the captain's authority was iron and his temper legendary, and no one had forgotten. The last man who questioned him now worked in the mines of Kestrel 9. Condemned to years of labor for a moment of doubt, the interrogation began not with blows, but with words sharpened into weapons. The captain circling her slowly, his boots heavy against the floor, his voice a rhythm of accusation. He spoke of intercepted transmissions, of human soldiers ambushed in sectors where only she had known their route, of whispers of betrayal, and though she denied nothing did not even dignify his claims with response, her silence itself was interpreted as guilt, and Kale could see how carefully she held herself, how every shallow breath was controlled, as if she knew the fragility of the line she walked between resistance and collapse. The guards fastened her to the restraint pole at the center of the bridge, chains clinking as they drew tight, and the sight was grotesque in its symbolism, as if she were less a prisoner and more an animal tethered for display. The crew shifted, uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Kale's hands hovered uselessly over his console, fingers brushing switches that suddenly seemed irrelevant. For what was navigation or system diagnostics when in the middle of the bridge a living being was stripped of dignity? He remembered the first time he had seen her, months earlier, when the fragile treaty was still alive. She had stepped aboard the Resolute not as a captive but as an emissary, her eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. And she had walked beside him in the hangar asking questions about human ships, their engines, their designs, her voice melodic and strangely earnest. He remembered the laughter that had slipped from her lips when he had joked clumsily about human food, her confusion at the concept of something as mundane as coffee, and that memory now clashed so violently with her current silence that his stomach knotted until he thought he might be sick. The captain gave the signal, and the first lash of current surged through the restraints. A cruel technology designed not to maim but to inflict maximum pain, and the alien princess's body arched violently, her lips finally breaking into sound. Not a scream, but a choked gasp that tore through the silence like the crack of a whip. Kale flinched despite himself, his head turning, his eyes refusing to settle on the spectacle, but he could still hear it, could still feel it vibrating through the air, and the sound would not leave him no matter how tightly he clenched his jaw. The captain's voice was steady, interrogating, demanding names, codes, confirmation of her betrayal, but each time the current struck she did not answer, she merely held on. Her silence a resistance more powerful than defiance. Cale's mind spun, torn between the drilled instincts of obedience and the human revulsion coiling in his chest, for he knew cruelty when he saw it, and this was no longer about extracting truth, it was about breaking her. He thought of his oath, sworn before deployment. Loyalty to captain in command above all. The survival of the ship and the success of the mission before personal conscience. But what was oath when confronted with a truth so unbearable that silence felt like complicity? The others knew it too. He could see it in the way the communications officer's hands shook as she typed, in the way the tactical chief swallowed hard before looking away. Yet they remained frozen in fear of consequence, unwilling to move, unwilling to risk themselves. Cale's heart pounded with memories he tried to suppress. Moments from the last campaign when the alien princes had been more than a figure of suspicion. He remembered the skirmish over the asteroid belt of Vera, when a reactor overload had nearly torn the Resolute apart, and she, then still a guest under the protection of treaty, had guided them through it, her knowledge of the anomaly saving the ship. He remembered her placing a hand, cool and trembling, on his arm in the chaos, whispering instructions that had allowed him to reroute power in time to stabilize the engines. She had saved him, not as an alien or a supposed enemy, but as someone who saw a life worth saving. That memory now burned in his mind as he watched her suffering at the hands of the very people she had once helped. He could not reconcile it, and the dissonance was tearing him apart from the inside. The captain, blind with conviction, pressed harder, demanding she confess, that she admit guilt, but her silence remained, broken only by the involuntary cries ripped from her throat with each jolt of current. To Cale it seemed less like justice and more like madness, a cruelty veiled in the thin veneer of authority. The hours stretched mercilessly, each one carving deeper lines of fatigue into the faces of the crew, each cry of the alien prince's scarring Cale's conscience further. By the time the captain finally ordered a pause, her head hung low, sweat slicking her skin, breaths shallow but unbroken, and still she had not spoken a word of betrayal. The captain called it proof of her defiance, a reason to intensify their methods, and as he gave orders to prepare harsher devices, Cale felt something inside him shift, a crack in the dam that had held back his fear, a whisper that grew louder, with every breath telling him that this was wrong, that this was not justice, not order, not the humanity he had sworn to protect. He clenched his fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms, his eyes fixed on the flicker of her chest, rising and falling, fragile but steady, and he realized he could not look away, not because he was compelled by cruelty, but because turning away would mean acceptance, would mean allowing it to happen unseen. His throat tightened as the truth settled like lead in his chest. If no one else would speak, if no one else would stand, then perhaps he would have to. He wasn't ready yet, not in that moment, but the thought had taken root, dangerous and unstoppable, and though the bridge remained filled with silence, beneath it pulsed the first quiet thrum of rebellion, a heartbeat that no captain could command. The air aboard the Resolute carried the heavy, metallic stench of blood and burnt circuits as alarms still whispered faintly through the corridors, muffled by emergency overrides but reminding every soul aboard that something irreversible had just happened, that the chain of command had been severed in the most brutal way, and that in the heart of that fracture stood one human pilot and one alien princess whose destinies had just been bound together by an act of treason, courage, and impossible love. And as Lieutenant Aaron Valen guided the alien princess down the darkened companionway away from the shattered bridge, he felt the weight of the blaster in his hand heavier than any weapon had ever felt before, not because of its mass but because of what it represented, because a few minutes ago it had barked fire and ended the life of Captain Drake, a man Aaron had once followed into battles, a man who had carried the United Terran banner like a weapon, and yet a man who had descended into cruelty so deep that he had strapped the alien princess to the captain's chair and broken her with questions and torment until her screams became just another background noise to the bridge crew. And Aaron's mind kept replaying the moment over and over, how the silence had fallen like a suffocating shroud after the shot, How Drake's body had slumped, how the bridge officers had stared at him wide-eyed, frozen between fear and disbelief, and how Aaron had seized the alien princess's chains and dragged her free while shouting at the others that, if they wanted to live, they'd stay out of his way, and some had tried, half-heartedly, to rise, but no one truly moved. Because deep down perhaps they too had seen the abyss Drake had become, and perhaps a part of them agreed, even if they could not say it, even if they would never admit it. The alien princess stumbled beside him, her breaths ragged and shallow, her dark eyes glassy from pain but still burning with a fire that was unmistakable, the kind of fire only found in someone who had endured torment and yet refused to let it define her, and when they reached the aft service corridor, Aaron pressed her against the wall and held a finger to his lips. Listening to the footsteps echoing through the ship, the officers regrouping, the Marines awakening to the reality that their captain was dead and that the second in command would soon be hunting them both, and Aaron whispered, "We don't have much time. They'll regroup. We need to reach the hangar bay." And though her voice trembled, the alien princess spoke with a steadiness that surprised him. "You killed your own leader for me. Do you know what that means?" And Aaron met her gaze and felt the words claw at his throat. Because he did know, he knew that he had just burned every bridge. That Earth would brand him a traitor, that his family would never see him as anything but a disgrace. But he also knew that watching Drake's cruelty had left him with no choice. Saving her had been the only act of humanity left within reach, and he whispered back, "It means there's no turning back now." They moved, keeping to the service tunnels, ducking under low-hanging conduits and slipping past crewmen who looked the other way rather than risk the confrontation. As they passed a viewport, Aaron caught a glimpse of the endless void outside, stars sharp and cold, and his stomach twisted because he knew the Resolute was not alone, that a Terran fleet hung nearby, waiting for orders, and Drake's death would send ripples through them all, ripples that might crash into a storm before the hour was out. The alien princess faltered again, her body shaking, and Aaron slid an arm around her to keep her steady, and he realized with a hollow pang that she had been tortured not just physically but starved, beaten, her wrists raw where the chains had cut into her, her skin carrying the faint glow of her kind's natural bioluminescence dimmed almost to nothing. And he said, "Just a little further." "You can make it," but her whisper cracked. "Why? Why risk everything? You don't even know me." And he answered, breath tight, "Because I couldn't stand and watch another second. Because whatever you are, whoever you are, you didn't deserve that." And she studied him, her expression unreadable, then gave the faintest nod, as though in that moment something fragile yet unbreakable had formed between them, an unspoken pact written not in words but in blood and defiance. The hangar bay loomed ahead, but it was no salvation yet, because armed Marines already stood by the main entrance, their rifles gleaming under harsh floodlights. And Aaron cursed under his breath, pulling the alien princes into the shadow of a maintenance alcove, his heart pounding as he scanned for options. And he saw it, the secondary hatch, the one used by engineers to bring in replacement parts, half concealed behind stacks of crates, and he knew it was risky. Knew it might be locked down, but he had no other choice, so he led her there, fingers trembling as he worked the manual override, praying the security lockdown hadn't yet reached this section. And when the door slid open with a low hiss of hydraulics, he exhaled relief sharp enough to hurt. Inside the hangar, the smell of fuel and ozone was overpowering, and the skeletal frames of shuttles and fighters stood in neat rows, some powered down, others mid-repair, and Aaron steered them toward the farthest shuttle, one with its hatch ajar and diagnostic lights blinking faintly, and as they climbed inside, the alien princess collapsed into one of the seats, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and Aaron knelt in front of her, saying softly, "We'll get you out. We'll find a way." But before he could finish the words, the cum unit on the shuttle flickered to life, and the harsh voice of Commander Hark, Drake's second, thundered through, "Lieutenant Valen, you've disgraced your uniform. Surrender now, or I will make sure the alien dies slowly and you watch from the void." And Aaron froze, his jaw tightening, because he knew Hark, knew he was colder than Drake, less theatrical but more ruthless. And he also knew Hark wouldn't bluff, But Aaron leaned close to the comm and said, voice steady, she's not dying on this ship. Not today, and with that he cut the line and began powering up the shuttle, systems humming to life as warning klaxons blared overhead, alerting the ship that an unauthorized launch was underway. The alien princess gripped his hand suddenly. Her touch warmed despite her weakness, and she whispered, they won't stop hunting us. Not ever, and Aaron met her gaze, feeling the truth of it sink into his bones. But he answered with a conviction he wasn't sure he believed yet. Then, let them hunt. We'll stay ahead. Outside the hangar, bulkheads began to close as Hark tried to trap them, and Aaron slammed his fist against the console, coaxing the shuttle engines to roar awake, and the craft shuddered as it lifted from the deck, slamming against the force field as the hangar doors opened reluctantly. But then, with a gut-wrenching lurch, they burst free into the starlit void. The hangar shrinking behind them as the Resolute loomed like a wounded beast, lights flickering, weapons pivoting to track them. The alien princess leaned weakly against the seat, her eyes closing as though sleep threatened to drag her down. But Aaron called her name, though he barely knew it, though he spoke it like a prayer, and he whispered, stay with me. Just a little longer, and as the shuttle arced into the void, alarms still wailing, Aaron realized that what had begun as a single shot on the bridge had now ignited something far larger, something that would spread across fleets and worlds. And he tightened his grip on the controls, knowing they were no longer just fugitives, they were a spark, and sparks had a way of lighting fires no one could ever put out again. The alarms of the battlecruiser still echoed faintly in the silent corridors. When the human and the alien princess reached the lower hangar, a place once bustling with deck crews and engineers but now abandoned in the chaos that followed his betrayal on the bridge, the walls still smelled of burnt circuitry where stray shots had scarred the panels, and the faint vibration under their boots told him the ship's engines still strained to keep her in formation with the fleet above the contested world. But he knew their time was vanishing as fast as the seconds between each heartbeat, and the weight of what they had done hung on them both like a cloak of fire, for he had turned his weapon on his captain, not just to stop the torture of the alien princess, but to reject everything the uniform on his back had once meant, and that truth made each step feel heavier, though the alien princess's presence beside him was like a flame guiding him through. Endless dark, her body weakened, but her eyes never more alive, reflecting both pain and something he never thought he would see in one who had been beaten and chained, trust in a human. He helped her down the final ladder to the hangar floor, his hands steadying her slim frame, though she tried to walk without leaning too much on him, her pride refusing to show weakness. But when she stumbled, he caught her and she whispered in her soft, breaking voice that she had not cried when the captain burned her skin with the interrogation rods, nor when the crew laughed at her shackled form, but now she wanted to weep because one human had chosen her life over his own world. And he told her to save her tears for freedom, though deep inside he feared they would never see it, for the hangar was guarded and he had only a blaster with half a charge left, his heartbeat a drum in his ears. They slipped behind the shadow of a grounded shuttle, its sleek hull pitted with carbon scoring from past battles, and he whispered his plan, though it was barely one at all. Take the auxiliary fighter docked at the far end, break free of the cruiser's tractor range, and dive into the chaos of the fleet engagement outside, hoping the confusion would shield them. And though it sounded like madness, the alien princess nodded, her silver-marked brow glowing faintly under the emergency lights, as if the ancient lineage in her blood had already seen the path they must take, for she said in her hoarse voice, that destiny was made not by empires but by moments like this, when one human and one alien chose to stand against chains. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, every creak of metal sounding like a death knell, until the inevitable shout broke through the hangar. Stop! And half a dozen armed Marines poured from the side hatch, rifles raised, their eyes blazing with loyalty to a dead captain, and the human knew this was where it would end unless fate bent. So he dragged the alien princess behind cover as shots cracked, burning lines through the air, sparks flying where bolts struck the shuttle hull, and he returned fire in bursts, forcing them back but not breaking their line. And in that crucible of fire the alien princess placed her trembling hand on his, channeling something ancient and otherworldly, and he felt warmth surge into him like a tide, steadying his aim, giving him strength beyond the limits of flesh. For her people had once been guardians of suns and carriers of memory across stars, and though she had been stripped and broken, the essence of who she was still burned, and through their bond, however fragile, he carried it into battle. They broke through the firefight, sprinting across open deck as alarms blared louder, and he blasted the fighter's hatch, forcing it open as she collapsed into the cockpit, her body shaking with exhaustion, but her voice firm as she urged him to fly. And though he had never piloted anything beyond training simulations, the controls felt alive under his hands, guided by something more than skill, as if the alien princess's will and his desperation had fused into one force. The engines roared, the deck shuddered, and the Marines shouted as they dove for cover, the fighters' thrusters lifting them off the hangar floor in a storm of fire, and then the hangar doors loomed ahead, still sealed with red lights warning that external launch clearance was denied. And in that instant, he made a choice. He fired everything the fighter had at the doors, a reckless move that shook the ship itself, alarms screaming as the reinforced blast shields melted and tore apart, and with a scream of tearing metal they burst into open space, debris spinning around them like meteors as the void welcomed them with its silent, merciless embrace. Outside, the battle was chaos incarnate, human cruisers exchanging fire with alien warships, beams of light cutting across the darkness, wreckage tumbling like dying stars, and into that storm the small fighter plunged, its hull shuddering under. Near misses, its shields flaring, but within the cockpit 2 lives clung together, united by a decision that neither empire could undo. The alien princess leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper, guiding him through the crossfire with knowledge of the fleet's formations, for she had studied her enemy even in captivity, and together they weaved between giants, dodging death, with every heartbeat until the stars opened before them, and for a moment they were free of the fleet's grasp. The world they orbited now a burning sphere below, scarred by bombardment yet still alive. He looked at her then, the alien princess who had been tortured on the bridge and yet refused to break, and he knew that what they had found in this crucible was not just escape, but the seed of something greater, something that could outlast fleets and empires, for if one human could defy his captain for her, perhaps others could see what he saw, that she was not the enemy but the future. And in that shared gaze the unspoken promise was made that no matter how the war raged, they would carry this truth together through fire and darkness until the stars themselves remembered it.